Elliot Blackwell, a grieving billionaire, is consumed by the weight of his son's illness and the loss of his wife. His life takes an unexpected turn when Sophie Alvarez, an unconventional and caring nanny, enters their world. Through her warmth and unique approach, she begins to heal not only Elliot's son, but also the broken parts of Elliot himself. As their bond deepens, secrets are uncovered, forcing Elliot to confront his past and consider a future he never imagined. This captivating story of love, loss, and second chances will leave you riveted until the final page. If you're ready to dive into this emotional journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications so you never miss an update. Like and comment your thoughts. Your support means everything. Now, let's begin the story. Elliot Blackwell stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his San Francisco penthouse, gazing out over the sprawling city below. The golden hues of the late afternoon sun bathed the skyline, casting long shadows across the gleaming towers of steel and glass. Yet, despite the view that could captivate anyone else, Elliot felt nothing. It was as if the vast panorama of his empire, his achievements, his wealth, his success, was a mere backdrop to a life that had lost its vibrancy. His home, a masterpiece of modern architecture, felt colder than any office building he had ever worked in. The silence echoed in his ears as he stood motionless, his hands resting against the edge of a sleek marble countertop. The hum of the city below was muffled, distant, like a world he could no longer reach. This penthouse, with its opulent decor and panoramic views, had once been a symbol of his triumphs. But now it was little more than an empty shell, a monument to everything he had achieved and lost. Elliot's thoughts drifted, as they so often did, to Evelyn, his wife, the woman who had once brought warmth and light into this home. She had been the center of his world, the heart of their family. They had shared dreams, ambitions, and a love so deep that it seemed impervious to the outside world. But that world had shattered when she passed away unexpectedly, leaving him adrift in a sea of grief and loneliness. It was as if the very foundation of his existence had been ripped away, leaving only the cold, unyielding structures of wealth and success. Since her death, Elliot had thrown himself into his work, his companies, his investments. He had become a tycoon in every sense of the word, expanding his empire, building new ventures, acquiring others. But none of it filled the void inside him. None of it could replace the warmth of Evelyn's smile, the sound of her laughter, the way she had always known how to make him feel whole. Now his only focus was Oliver, their son. At 12, Oliver was bright, curious, and full of life. But his life had been overshadowed by a rare medical condition that required constant care. The best doctors, the finest specialists, and a small army of caregivers had been brought in to ensure Oliver's well-being. But no matter how many resources Elliot poured into his son's treatment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The medical team could help Oliver physically, but who could help him emotionally? Who could bring the light back into his son's eyes and maybe, just maybe, bring a little warmth back into the cold walls of their home? Elliot had tried to ignore the gnawing feeling of helplessness that clawed at him whenever he saw Oliver struggle. He couldn't afford to let his son see the despair in his heart, not when Oliver was already facing so much. But it was getting harder to keep up the facade. Despite his best efforts, Elliot couldn't fill the emptiness that had taken root in his soul. As if on cue, the sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Clara, his assistant, entered the room, holding a thick folder in her hands. She was a sharp woman, professional and efficient, but even she couldn't hide the concern in her eyes. It was the kind of concern she had carried since Evelyn's death, the kind that whispered in the silence of the office, in the stillness of the house, when no one else was around. "Mr. Blackwell," she began softly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. "I have the nanny applications you requested." Elliot turned slowly, his eyes focusing on the folder in her hands. He hadn't asked for it, not directly, but he knew Clara had been preparing for this moment. She had seen his growing concern for Oliver, seen the strain in his eyes as he tried to balance the demands of his business with the overwhelming responsibility of caring for his son. And so, in her quiet, unobtrusive way, Clara had taken it upon herself to find someone who might help them both. He sighed, rubbing his temples before gesturing for her to come closer. I don't know if I'm ready for this, he muttered, almost to himself. I don't know if anyone could fill that role. Evelyn's shoes, I just don't think anyone can. Clara placed the folder on the desk in front of him, her expression softening. I understand, she said gently, but you don't have to do this alone anymore. Oliver needs someone, and maybe, just maybe, you do too. Elliot paused, his gaze fixed on the folder. There were so many names, so many resumes, each one a promise of hope, of care, of someone who might finally be able to bridge the gap between Oliver's medical needs and his emotional ones. But the thought of letting someone else into their world, into the house that still smelled faintly of Evelyn's perfume, the house that was more a tomb than a home, filled him with dread. Clara must have sensed his hesitation, because she added, You don't have to make a decision today, but maybe we could start by meeting with a few candidates. Get a feel for them. Elliot looked at the folder again, the weight of his indecision pressing down on him. He had made so many decisions in his life, important ones, life-changing ones. But this felt different. This was about his son. This was about opening his heart again, about allowing someone else into their carefully constructed world. With a deep breath, Elliot nodded. All right, he said, his voice quieter than usual. Let's start with the interviews. But Clara, I need to be sure. I can't afford any more mistakes. Clara gave a reassuring nod, knowing full well that this was just the first step in a long and uncertain journey. As she turned to leave, she glanced back at him. You're not alone in this, Mr. Blackwell. We'll find the right person for Oliver, and for you. Elliot remained standing by the window, staring out over the city as the sun dipped below the horizon. He had always prided himself on his ability to control everything in his life, but this was beyond him. All he could do now was wait and hope that someone would be able to heal the wounds that had festered for far too long. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind filled with uncertainty, Elliot Blackwell began the search for the one person who might help him and his son reclaim the life they had once known. The days that followed felt like a blur to Elliot. He pored over the nanny applications that Clara had given him, but none of the candidates seemed right. Some were too polished, too perfect, practically designed for the job, but lacking something intangible that he couldn't quite put his finger on. Others seemed too inexperienced, too raw. In the quiet moments when he wasn't focused on work or his son, Elliot found himself staring at the papers in front of him, feeling a sense of growing frustration. How could he trust anyone with Oliver? With Evelyn gone, he wasn't sure if he could trust himself, let alone anyone else. But then, as if by fate, one resume caught his attention. It wasn't the most polished. It didn't have the standard certifications or the most impressive list of references. But there was something about the name, the woman behind it. Sophie Alvarez. The photo on her resume was simple, a soft smile on a young woman with dark brown hair and eyes that, in a way, seemed to look straight through him. But it wasn't the photo that drew him in. It was the personal statement. Sophie Alvarez wasn't just a nanny. She was a former pediatric nurse who had spent several years in a children's hospital before leaving the profession to care for her ailing mother. The words she wrote about her experience resonated with him on a deeper level. Caregiving, she wrote, is not just about administering treatments or following protocols. It's about making a connection, creating a safe space where a person feels seen and heard, especially children who might not have the words to express their fears or their needs. Elliot paused, rereading those lines. Making a connection, safe space. Those words lingered in his mind like a quiet whisper. Could it be that someone could actually fill the role Evelyn had once held, not just physically taking care of Oliver, but emotionally filling the gap left by her absence? Against his instincts, Elliot asked Clara to schedule an interview. He needed to meet Sophie Alvarez, needed to see if the words on paper matched the person in front of him. The morning of the interview, Elliot found himself unusually anxious. He couldn't put his finger on why, but a gnawing sense of anticipation settled in his stomach. He paced his office, checking his watch repeatedly. It wasn't just about finding a caregiver for Oliver anymore. It was about finding someone who might be able to unlock a part of him that had been locked away since Evelyn's death. And that terrified him. Sophie arrived right on time. As she stepped into his office, Elliot was struck by her presence. She wasn't stunning in the conventional sense. Her features were soft, almost delicate. But there was a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. She looked him straight in the eye when she spoke, her posture open and unguarded. "Mr. Blackwell," she greeted him warmly, her voice steady but gentle. "It's a pleasure to meet you." He motioned for her to sit, trying to suppress the sense of unease that had settled in his chest. "Please, call me Elliot. Thank you for coming." Sophie smiled and nodded as she took a seat across from him. The way she held herself made him feel immediately at ease, and yet the undercurrent of caution in him remained. This was business. He couldn't afford to be sentimental. Not now, not after everything that had happened. "Tell me a little about yourself, Sophie," Elliot began, his tone professional but still somewhat distant. "You have an interesting background." Sophie nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Yes, I spent 5 years working as a pediatric nurse in a hospital before I had to leave to care for my mother. I've always been drawn to children, especially those who need more than just medical care. Children who are scared, who are dealing with something bigger than themselves. I've learned over the years that sometimes the most important thing we can offer them is a sense of stability and connection. That's why I decided to leave the hospital and focus on private caregiving. I wanted to make a difference in a child's life, not just as a nurse, but as someone who can offer emotional support too." Elliot listened closely, noting the sincerity in her voice. There was no bravado, no rehearsed speech. Just someone who had clearly seen the struggles of children firsthand and understood the delicate balance between physical and emotional care. Her words struck a chord within him, but he had to remain guarded. Was this really what Oliver needed? "You mentioned offering emotional support," Elliot said, his voice measured. "How do you handle situations when a child doesn't immediately respond to you, or when they're reluctant to trust someone new?" Sophie's eyes softened as she answered. "It's not about pushing them to open up or to trust you on your terms. It's about meeting them where they are. Every child has their own pace. Some will take a little longer to warm up, and that's okay. The key is to be consistent and patient, to show them you're there for the long haul. Sometimes, just sitting beside them, even in silence, can be enough to create that trust. The emotional connection comes naturally when you respect their boundaries and let them feel safe." Elliot couldn't help but feel a twinge of admiration. She spoke with such clarity and conviction, as if she had learned these lessons the hard way, and perhaps she had. He could sense the weight of experience behind her words. But still, he remained cautious. Trust was not something he gave lightly, not after everything that had happened. "There's something else you should know," he said, leaning forward slightly. "My son, Oliver, has a medical condition. It's rare, and it requires constant monitoring and care. We have cameras throughout the house to ensure that his needs are always met. I need someone who can work within those parameters." Sophie's expression didn't change. She met his gaze without hesitation. "I understand. I've worked in environments with surveillance before, and I'm comfortable with that. My priority is Oliver's well-being, and if that means working within certain boundaries, then that's what I'll do." Elliot studied her for a long moment. Her calm demeanor, her unwavering certainty. She didn't seem rattled by the mention of the cameras or the implications of the job. There was no hesitation, no discomfort, just a steady resolve. "I appreciate your honesty, Sophie," he said slowly. "But I need to be sure that you're the right fit for this family. I'm not just hiring a caregiver. I'm hiring someone who will be a part of Oliver's life, and I can't afford to make any mistakes." Sophie nodded, her eyes earnest. "I understand, Elliot. I'm not here just for the job. I'm here because I believe I can help. And I'll do everything I can to make sure Oliver feels supported and cared for." The sincerity in her voice gave him pause. She wasn't just saying what he wanted to hear. She genuinely believed in what she was offering. He knew, in that moment, that she might be the one. "I'll give you a chance," Elliot said, his voice firm but tinged with uncertainty. "But know this, there are cameras throughout the house. I'm not trying to control you, but I need to know you're looking out for Oliver in every way." Sophie smiled, her warmth never fading. "I understand, Elliot, and I'll prove to you that you made the right decision." With that, he stood, extending his hand. "Welcome to the team, Sophie." As their hands clasped, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something significant. He wasn't sure what, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the smallest spark of hope. A fragile light in the shadow of all he'd lost, one he hadn't dared believe could return. Like finding a kindred spirit when all seemed desolate, Sophie's presence suggested that rebuilding wasn't impossible. It was simply a matter of trust, patience, and the courage to start again. The next morning, the Blackwell estate was unusually still. Elliot had already spent an hour in his office, reviewing the latest financial reports, but his mind kept wandering back to the interview with Sophie. He had agreed to give her a chance, but doubts still nagged at him. Could she truly make a difference in Oliver's life? Could anyone? As he stood by the window of his office, looking out at the sweeping view of the San Francisco skyline, his thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of his phone. A message from Clara, simply reading, "Sophie has arrived. She's ready to begin." Elliot took a deep breath and made his way downstairs to meet her. The house felt cold and empty without Evelyn's presence. And despite the staff around him, Elliot often felt as though he was walking through a shell of the life he once had. He hadn't realized how much he had hoped for this new start until now. Sophie was standing by the front door when Elliot entered the foyer. She was holding a small, neatly wrapped box in her hands. Her smile, warm and welcoming, greeted him immediately, and for a moment he saw a glimpse of what he'd been missing, the human connection that had felt absent for so long. "Good morning, Elliot," Sophie said, her voice calm yet upbeat. "I brought a little something for Oliver. I thought it might help make the transition a little easier for him." Elliot raised an eyebrow, surprised at the gesture. "Thank you. I'm sure he'll appreciate it." She nodded, her gaze turning toward the staircase, where Oliver was waiting in his room. "Would you mind if I went up to see him now? I'd like to introduce myself properly." Elliot motioned for her to go ahead, his heart pounding slightly in his chest. Watching Sophie with Oliver was the moment of truth. He had been so protective of his son for so long, wary of anyone who could disrupt their carefully crafted routine. Sophie seemed like the kind of person who could connect with Oliver in a way he hadn't expected. But could she really break through his son's walls? Sophie ascended the stairs with a quiet confidence, carrying the small gift in her hands. Elliot followed at a distance, still unsure of what to expect. As she reached the door to Oliver's room, she knocked gently before entering. Inside, Oliver was sitting on the floor, surrounded by his collection of books and toys. He looked up as Sophie entered, his bright blue eyes meeting hers with cautious curiosity. He had inherited Evelyn's eyes, a reminder of the love and loss that hung over their family. Sophie crouched down to his level, her demeanor gentle but confident. "Hi, Oliver," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I brought you something special. It's a constellation projector. You can use it to watch the stars in your room. Do you like stars?" Oliver's eyes widened as he looked at the box in her hands. There was a brief flicker of interest, but he didn't move to take it immediately. Instead, he studied Sophie carefully, as if weighing her intentions. Sophie smiled and placed the box gently on the floor in front of him. "I thought you might like it. I know the stars can feel far away, but now you can have them right here in your room." She sat back a little, giving him space to make the next move. Elliot watched from the hallway, feeling a twinge of anxiety in his chest. He had seen so many caregivers try to engage Oliver before, and they all failed to break through his walls. Oliver was a quiet, introspective child, often lost in his own world. But as he watched Sophie sit patiently with his son, he saw something different in her approach. It wasn't forced. It wasn't rehearsed. She wasn't trying to push him or rush him. She simply allowed him to take the lead. Oliver, after a long moment of contemplation, reached out and gently picked up the projector. His fingers traced the edges of the box before he looked up at Sophie. "What does it do?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with cautious wonder. Sophie's smile widened. "It helps you see the stars inside your room. Would you like to try it together?" Oliver nodded slightly, still wary but intrigued. Sophie showed him how to set it up, and within moments, the room was filled with the soft, shimmering lights of 1,000 tiny stars projected across the ceiling. Oliver's face lit up as the constellations began to take shape above them. Elliot, still watching from the doorway, felt a strange knot in his chest loosen. He hadn't realized how much he'd been hoping for this moment. Sophie had done something so simple, so natural, yet it had touched Oliver in a way nothing else had in a long time. The room no longer felt like a sterile hospital ward. It felt like a space of possibility, filled with warmth and wonder. Sophie continued to engage with Oliver in the same calm, unhurried manner, asking him questions about the stars and gently guiding him to explore the constellations. She wasn't rushing him. She wasn't trying to make him like her. She simply met him where he was, respecting his pace. Over the next few hours, Sophie began to weave playful activities into Oliver's day. They worked on puzzles together, read stories, and even made up games involving Oliver's favorite animals. But more than that, Sophie subtly integrated therapy into their activities, softly encouraging Oliver to engage with his emotions and express himself. She introduced deep breathing exercises and guided him through simple stretches, always in a gentle, unobtrusive way. Elliot watched through the cameras, his eyes fixated on the screen. He could see the natural connection forming between them. It wasn't just the way Sophie played with Oliver or got him to smile. It was the way she had reached him without demanding anything in return. There was no rush, no sense of urgency in her approach. She allowed him to engage when he was ready, never pushing, but always present. As the hours passed, Elliot noticed a subtle shift. Oliver, who typically avoided eye contact and remained quiet throughout the day, was now speaking more openly, even laughing at some of Sophie's playful antics. It was the first time in months that he had truly seen his son engage in something so joyfully, without the usual distance. For the first time in what felt like forever, a spark of hope ignited inside Elliot. He wasn't sure if it was Sophie's presence alone, or if it was the realization that Oliver was finally starting to open up again. But something was changing. The fortress around his son's heart seemed to be cracking, and he couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude towards Sophie for being the catalyst. He didn't know where this would lead, or how much Sophie could truly help them. But for the first time in years, Elliot allowed himself to hope. Hope that Oliver might start to find joy again. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the darkness that had shrouded their lives since Evelyn's passing could start to lift. And as he watched Sophie and Oliver, Elliot realized something else. That he was beginning to feel something too. Something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. A small, tentative spark of connection. The days that followed Sophie's arrival felt like a slow, delicate unraveling. It wasn't that things were going wrong. Quite the opposite, actually. Sophie was making progress, connecting with Oliver in ways Elliot had only dreamed of. But with each passing day, Elliot found himself wrestling with an uneasy feeling, a nagging sense that Sophie was testing the boundaries he had so carefully set up to protect his son. Sophie's methods were unconventional. She didn't rely on rigid routines or sterile schedules. She was intuitive, spontaneous even, and it was clear she wasn't afraid to take risks if it meant reaching Oliver. One afternoon, as Elliot worked in his study, he heard the faint sound of laughter drifting through the house. He rose from his desk, curious, and made his way to the source. In the kitchen, Sophie was sitting at the island, carefully stirring a large pot on the stove. Oliver, his eyes wide with interest, was watching her closely. The smell of something rich and savory filled the air. And for a moment, Elliot felt a flicker of curiosity. He had to admit it smelled far better than the usual bland meals Oliver had been limited to. Sophie looked up and smiled as he entered. "Good afternoon, Elliot. I've prepared something special for Oliver today. A soup that's both nutritious and easy on his stomach, but with flavors he might actually enjoy. It's a blend of root vegetables, lean protein, and a few herbs, all within his dietary restrictions." Elliot glanced at the pot, then at Sophie, his expression unreadable. He had long been meticulous about Oliver's diet, especially since his health condition had made it necessary to keep a tight grip on what he could and couldn't eat. He wasn't about to let a caregiver, no matter how well-intentioned, compromise that control. "I appreciate the effort, Sophie," Elliot said, his voice cool but polite. "But I'm not sure this is a good idea. I've always relied on the nutritionist's guidelines for Oliver's meals. His condition is delicate. I don't want to take any chances." Sophie didn't flinch. She was used to navigating parents' anxieties, especially when it came to their children's health. "I understand your concerns, Elliot," she said softly, her eyes meeting his with quiet resolve. "I've reviewed Oliver's medical history and dietary requirements extensively. The ingredients I've used are all safe and tailored to his needs. I promise this will be gentle on his system and, hopefully, a bit more enjoyable for him than the usual bland meals." Elliot remained silent for a moment, scrutinizing her. Sophie's tone was calm, confident. She wasn't pushing him, but she wasn't backing down either. The more he thought about it, the more he realized she wasn't just throwing caution to the wind. She had a plan, and she believed in it. "Fine," he said at last, his voice tight. "But I'll need to see the full breakdown of the meal. Ingredients, amounts, everything. I'll want to review it all before it's served to Oliver." Sophie nodded, undeterred. "Of course. I'll send you all the details." As she continued to prepare the soup, Elliot lingered in the kitchen for a while, watching her with a mixture of skepticism and reluctant curiosity. Sophie's approach was different from what he was used to, but for some reason, it felt right. He couldn't deny that she had a gift for making Oliver feel seen, for creating a sense of normalcy in their otherwise rigid routine. Still, his need for control remained as strong as ever. Later that evening, Elliot sat at the dining table, reviewing Sophie's detailed plan for the soup. It was thorough, well thought out, and exactly within Oliver's medical guidelines. He couldn't argue with the logic. After a long moment of hesitation, he relented. "All right," he muttered to himself, "I'll let her try." The next day, Sophie served the soup to Oliver, who, to Elliot's surprise, ate it with enthusiasm. His son, who had often pushed his food around on the plate or simply refused to eat altogether, now looked up at Sophie with a faint smile as he finished the last spoonful. Elliot couldn't help but watch from the doorway, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and confusion. Was this really happening? Was Sophie's approach actually making a difference? But just as he began to relax, the unease returned. It wasn't just the food that worried him. It was everything. Sophie had been suggesting more changes, more risks, and he wasn't sure he was ready to give up the control he'd held over Oliver's life for so long. The next day, Sophie broached the subject of outings. "I was thinking it might be good for Oliver to get out of the house for a while," she said, her voice gentle but insistent. "A change of scenery might do him some good. I know he's been inside for a while, and he loves the outdoors." Elliot's reaction was immediate and sharp. "No," he said, his voice firm. "It's too risky. His condition makes him vulnerable to even the smallest change in routine. We can't afford to take chances. Besides, what if something happens while we're out? What if he gets sick or worse?" Sophie met his gaze calmly, her expression unwavering. "Elliot, I understand your concern, but sometimes it's the things we can't control that help us grow. Oliver needs to experience life beyond these walls. He's been inside for so long, and it's taking a toll on him emotionally. He's isolating himself." "I'm not risking his health for a change of scenery," Elliot snapped, the words coming out sharper than he intended. Sophie took a breath, clearly choosing her next words carefully. "I'm not asking you to take unnecessary risks. We can start small, just a short walk in the garden or a visit to a nearby park. But keeping him locked away like this, it's not healthy for him, Elliot. And it's not healthy for you either." Elliot stiffened, his jaw tightening. She had no right to make judgments about what was healthy for him, for his son. But there was something about her words that lingered, something that made him pause. He knew she was right. Oliver had been cooped up in the house for months, and he wasn't the same joyful, curious child he once was. He was withdrawing, retreating into himself, and Elliot couldn't help but wonder if his overprotectiveness was a part of the reason. As Sophie's words hung in the air, Elliot felt a flicker of doubt, something he hadn't felt in years. Was his need for control really helping Oliver? Or was it stifling him, keeping him trapped in a world of isolation and fear? For the first time since Sophie had come into their lives, Elliot began to question the boundaries he had so rigidly imposed. It was hard to admit, but he couldn't ignore the fact that Sophie's methods were making a difference. Maybe it was time to let go of some of that control, for Oliver's sake. Elliot took a deep breath, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. "We'll start small," he said, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. But if anything happens, Sophie smiled, her eyes filled with understanding. I'll be careful, I promise. And with that, Elliot realized something he hadn't been able to admit before. Sophie wasn't just challenging his boundaries. She was helping him see that sometimes breaking free from control was the only way forward. As the days went by, the tension between Elliot and Sophie began to ease. It wasn't as though they had suddenly become friends, but there was a new understanding between them. The trust that had once been so hard for Elliot to extend was starting to build, brick by brick, in the quiet moments they shared. Sophie was patient, never pushing, always present in ways that made it easier for him to let his guard down, if only a little at a time. It was one of those moments that changed everything. The house was still, with the late afternoon light filtering softly through the curtains. Sophie was sitting beside Oliver, helping him with one of his puzzles, while Elliot worked from his study, glancing up occasionally. There was something about the peacefulness of the scene that pulled at him, a reminder of how different things used to be before Evelyn's death, before everything changed. The quiet was comfortable. But it also made the pain from the past stir, as it always did in these rare moments of calm. Elliot felt the weight of it in his chest, the pressure of the grief he had been carrying for years, quietly suffocating him with its unspoken intensity. He thought about Evelyn, about her laughter, her boundless energy, and the way she had made life feel full, even when it was hard. She was so alive, so full of love for their family. And then in a single moment, she was gone. Elliot closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push the thoughts away. But they wouldn't leave. He felt Sophie's presence in the room beside him, and the quiet understanding between them was enough to nudge him forward. He had never spoken to anyone about Evelyn like this, not since her death. With a deep breath, he stood and made his way to the living room, where Sophie and Oliver were still working on the puzzle. Sophie looked up as he approached, her expression calm, encouraging, without a hint of intrusion. She had a way of making him feel safe, as though she wasn't waiting for him to speak, but simply present, ready for whatever he had to offer. Elliot cleared his throat, his voice low as he sat down on the couch beside her. I never told you about Evelyn. Not really. About who she was. It's not something I talk about much. Sophie nodded, her gaze gentle but not pitying. You don't have to tell me, Elliot. Only if you want to. He met her eyes, and for a moment, it felt as though the walls he had built around himself might just crumble. She had a way of drawing him out, of making him feel that it was okay to speak the things he had been keeping hidden for so long. I want to, he said softly. It's just, sometimes I forget how much she meant to me until moments like these. When I remember her laughter, the way she saw beauty in everything, even in the little things. He paused, his throat tight. She had this light inside of her, you know? And when she left, it left me in pieces. I didn't know how to pick them up. I still don't. Sophie's voice was steady, full of warmth. I understand. Grief is a kind of silence, isn't it? A noise that keeps echoing, even after the world moves on. Elliot looked at her, surprised by the depth of her words. It wasn't just empathy. It was understanding. An understanding that went beyond the surface of sympathy. Sophie wasn't just speaking from a place of kindness. It was a quiet acknowledgement of pain that mirrored his own. My wife? Elliot's voice broke slightly as he continued. She loved life in a way that made everything around us feel bigger, more alive. She saw joy everywhere, even in the simplest things. But I couldn't see that after she was gone. I could only see the loss. I couldn't see past the pain. Sophie was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the puzzle Oliver was still piecing together. Finally, she spoke again, her voice soft but filled with a kind of knowing. I know what that feels like, Elliot, she said, her eyes meeting his with a depth that took him by surprise. I lost someone too, someone I loved deeply. She paused, looking away for a moment as if gathering the strength to speak. When she looked back, there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. My fiancé, William. He passed away while I was caring for him. He had a rare heart condition, and one night, it happened. I was there, and I couldn't save him. Elliot felt the air between them shift. Sophie's confession, raw and unguarded, pulled him in deeper. It wasn't just sympathy she was offering. She was offering solidarity, shared grief, a kind of mutual recognition of the loss that had shaped both of their lives in ways they hadn't expected. I'm sorry, Elliot said, the words feeling inadequate. But it was all he could offer. Sophie gave him a small, understanding smile. It's been a long time, but I think I'm still learning how to live with it. How to move forward without feeling like I've abandoned him. She sighed softly, her eyes far away for a moment. The truth is, after he died, I didn't want to care for anyone anymore. I thought if I did, it would be like betraying him somehow. But I found myself needing to help others, to be there for someone, even if I didn't think I was ready. Elliot absorbed her words, the weight of them settling over him like a blanket. For a long time, he had thought his grief was something only he could understand. But Sophie's story showed him otherwise. They had both carried the same kind of loss that hadn't just taken away their loved ones, but had reshaped their lives in ways they hadn't known how to reconcile. I think we both understand that pain, he said quietly. The pain of losing someone who felt like you're everything. I don't know how to stop feeling it, Sophie. It feels like it's just part of me now. Sophie nodded, her expression soft. I think you'll find a way to live with it. Not to forget, but to find a way to move forward. It's not about erasing the past. It's about finding a way to carry it with you. For a long while, neither of them spoke. There was a comfort in the silence, a kind of peace that came from sharing the weight of their grief without the pressure to fix it. Sophie wasn't offering solutions or platitudes. She was simply offering her understanding, her presence. And for the first time in a long time, Elliot felt like it was enough. Meanwhile, Oliver, who had been quietly listening from the other side of the room, turned to his father with a question that had been bubbling up inside him for days. Dad, what was Mom like? His voice was tentative, as if he was unsure whether it was okay to ask. Elliot looked at his son, the ache in his chest tightening. It had been so long since he had spoken of Evelyn, and yet her presence was always there, just beneath the surface. He looked into Oliver's eyes, seeing the same curiosity he had once had as a child, and for the first time in years, he smiled, a bittersweet smile. She was beautiful, Elliot said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Not just in how she looked, but in how she made everyone around her feel. She had this way of seeing the world, like it was a place full of wonder, full of possibilities. And she taught me that it was okay to dream big. She never let me forget how amazing life could be, even when things were hard. Oliver smiled, his eyes brightening at the thought of the mother he had never truly known. I think I would have liked her, he said softly. Elliot's heart swelled with emotion. I know you would have, Ollie. I know you would have. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the shared grief and gentle understanding between him and Sophie, Elliot felt something stir deep within him, a glimmer of hope. For the first time in a long time, he realized that while grief could never be fully erased, it didn't have to consume him. There was still room for connection, for love, and for new beginnings. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had once believed. It was a night that started like any other, with the sound of the wind howling outside, battering against the windows of the Blackwell estate. The storm had been brewing for hours, dark clouds obscuring the moon, the rain pouring down in sheets. Inside, the warmth of the house provided a stark contrast to the chaos of nature outside. Elliot sat in his study, reviewing documents, while Sophie and Oliver sat in the living room, playing a game that they had started just a few days ago. Oliver had been in good spirits all afternoon, as he often was since Sophie's arrival. She had this rare gift, an ability to make him feel at ease, to make him forget about his illness, even if just for a little while. It had been a subtle transformation, but one that didn't go unnoticed by Elliot. Sophie's calm energy had worked wonders, and the bond between her and Oliver was undeniable. But tonight, as the wind picked up and the storm grew fiercer, something changed. It was a soft cough at first, hardly noticeable over the sounds of the storm. Elliot barely glanced up, assuming it was nothing more than a small discomfort. But when he heard it again, this time a sharp, wheezing cough followed by a gasp for breath, his heart jolted in his chest. He rushed to the living room, already dreading what he might find. Oliver was sitting on the floor, his face pale, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Sophie was kneeling beside him, her hands gently resting on his shoulders, her eyes focused, calm, and steady. Elliot's stomach sank as he moved closer, the sense of dread thickening with each step. What's happening? He asked, his voice strained, already filled with panic. Sophie looked up at him, her gaze steady but filled with a quiet urgency. It's a flare-up, she said calmly, though her voice had a firmness to it that made Elliot pause. It's the condition he's been battling. Sometimes there are moments like this where his breathing becomes labored. It's not uncommon, but it's serious. We need to stay calm, Elliot. Elliot's instinct was to react immediately, to rush to the hospital, to do anything that would guarantee Oliver's safety. But something in Sophie's voice held him back. It wasn't fear or uncertainty that filled her, but control. She exuded an air of confidence, of experience, and that, for a split second, made Elliot hesitate. Should we take him to the hospital? He asked, his voice desperate. His eyes flicked from Oliver, who was now struggling to catch his breath, to Sophie, searching her face for any sign of panic. No, Sophie replied with quiet assurance. I can handle this here. We have everything we need. Elliot looked between Sophie and Oliver, his heart pounding. This was a delicate moment, and he knew it. It felt as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the right move. He could see the faint tremor in Oliver's body, the way his small chest rose and fell erratically. The worry gnawed at Elliot's insides, but Sophie's calm demeanor anchored him. What do you need me to do? Elliot asked, his voice softer now, his mind still racing, but willing to listen. Sophie didn't hesitate. I need you to trust me, Elliot, she said, her voice steady but filled with an authority that was impossible to ignore. Sit with him. Hold him. Let him know you're here. I'll guide him through this. With no time to waste, Elliot sank down beside his son, reaching for Oliver, who was now trembling in Sophie's arms. He instinctively held Oliver's hand, feeling the cold sweat on his son's palm, and brushed the damp strands of hair from his forehead. Sophie, still kneeling on the floor, took a deep breath. Oliver, she began in a soothing voice, I need you to focus on me, okay? We're going to take slow, deep breaths together, in through your nose and out through your mouth, just like we practiced. Elliot felt helpless as he watched Sophie guide Oliver through the breathing techniques. She spoke to him in a calm, rhythmic voice, guiding him gently through each inhale and exhale, her hands resting on his chest, offering comfort with every movement. For a moment, Elliot couldn't understand how Sophie remained so composed. The stakes were high, too high for him to remain calm in the face of his son's suffering. Yet there she was, leading Oliver through the storm with such quiet strength. Her actions were precise, grounded in experience, yet her voice had a warmth to it that made Elliot feel a sense of security. It was as if she knew exactly what to do, knew exactly what Oliver needed. As the minutes passed, Sophie continued to guide Oliver through each breath, her words steady and soothing. You're doing great, Oliver. Keep breathing. You're safe with me. Elliot could feel his anxiety starting to ebb as he watched Oliver's breathing slowly begin to stabilize. It was slow, gradual, but noticeable. Sophie didn't take her eyes off Oliver, never faltering in her calm presence. She was everything Elliot needed in that moment, everything he hadn't realized he needed. She wasn't just a caregiver, a hired hand in their lives. She was something more. She was someone who could make the unbearable seem bearable, someone who could help his son through moments that would have torn him apart. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, Oliver's breathing evened out. His little body, which had been trembling, relaxed, and he leaned into his father's embrace. Sophie's eyes met Elliot's, her expression filled with quiet relief. See, she said, a soft smile on her lips. He's going to be okay. Elliot sat there, still holding Oliver close, as his son slowly drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep. His heart was still racing, but a wave of gratitude washed over him, mixed with something more profound, something he hadn't expected. He had trusted Sophie, had let go of his own instincts to rush to the hospital, and it had worked. Oliver was safe. But it wasn't just about that moment. It was the way Sophie had carried them through it, how she had become a steady presence, a calm in the storm. She had shown him something he hadn't allowed himself to see before. He wasn't just relying on her to care for Oliver. He was beginning to rely on her for himself as well. In that moment, he realized just how much he needed her, just how integral she had become to their lives. For the first time in a long time, Elliot allowed himself to admit that Sophie was more than just a caregiver. She was a part of their family now. And perhaps, in a way, she was becoming the person he hadn't even known he needed. As he sat there, his arms around his sleeping son, Elliot's gaze shifted to Sophie. She was standing nearby, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the storm outside. She had just saved his son's life, and in doing so, she had unknowingly begun to heal something within him as well. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he felt a spark of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for more than just survival. Maybe, for the first time in a long time, there could be something like happiness again. The house was quiet that evening, as it often was once Oliver had gone to bed. Elliot had retreated to his study, where he spent most of his time since Evelyn's passing. The room was a sanctuary for him, filled with the cold glow of the desk lamp and the muted hum of the city below. It was here that he found solace in solitude, a place where he could bury himself in work and forget about the rest of the world. Yet, even in the quietest corners of his mind, Evelyn's absence lingered like a wound that never fully healed. Sophie, on the other hand, had been spending the evening in the library, organizing some old paperwork that had accumulated over the years. She had already developed a natural curiosity about the Blackwell estate, often exploring parts of the house that had been left untouched for years. It was there, amidst the stacks of old files, that she came across something she hadn't expected, a folder that didn't belong among the others. The folder was thick, its contents sealed with a simple paperclip, and when she flipped it open, Sophie's eyes fell on a report that stopped her cold. The document was a police report dated shortly after Evelyn's fatal accident. The words on the page seemed to blur at first, but as she focused, a chill ran through her. The report didn't match the narrative Elliot had told her. There were details about mechanical failures in Evelyn's car that had been previously dismissed, but there was something else. An indication of tampering, the possibility that the brakes had been deliberately sabotaged. The suggestion was faint, the evidence circumstantial at best, but it was enough to make Sophie's heart race. The report felt like a crack in the foundation of everything she had come to understand about the Blackwell family. She knew this wasn't something she was meant to see, but there it was. Something that seemed to open up a whole new world of questions about Evelyn's death, about the grief that had consumed Elliot, and perhaps even about the man who had hired her. Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she carefully folded the report back into the folder, placing it on the desk in front of her. She stared at it for a moment longer, contemplating whether she should say anything. Her instincts told her it wasn't the right time to bring it up, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something needed to be addressed. The unspoken tension between her and Elliot, the way he never seemed to fully confront the past, the way he avoided talking about Evelyn, had grown more evident with each passing day. The truth was buried in that folder, but it was a truth that had been left unresolved, and it was eating away at him. And at Oliver, too. She was about to leave the library when she heard the familiar sound of footsteps in the hallway. Elliot was walking towards her, his figure appearing in the doorway. His gaze was distant, lost in his own thoughts, until he saw the folder on the desk. Sophie froze. She could feel his eyes on her, the air thick with unspoken questions. For a moment, she didn't know whether to speak or remain silent, but Elliot had already crossed the threshold, his sharp eyes flicking from the folder to her face. "What is this?" Elliot's voice was sharp, low, and controlled, though Sophie could hear the faint edge of tension that betrayed his calm exterior. Sophie's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing. She had been caught, but how could she explain what she had just read? She hadn't meant to invade his privacy. She hadn't meant to uncover something so sensitive. But there was no turning back now. I didn't mean to. Sophie started, her voice faltering slightly as she glanced from the folder to his piercing gaze. Elliot didn't wait for her to finish. His jaw tightened, his expression hardening into something unfamiliar, something cold. "You went through my things," he said, his voice now carrying the weight of accusation. "You invaded my privacy." Sophie's heart beat faster, but she didn't look away. She could feel the anger rising in him, the raw emotion that he had long since buried beneath layers of control. This wasn't just about the report. It was about everything, the grief he had refused to face, the secrets he had kept hidden from her, from Oliver. "I didn't mean to pry," Sophie said carefully, her voice steady but laced with a quiet honesty. "But it's not just about this, is it, Elliot? It's about the truth, about Evelyn, about what happened to her." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them seemed to crackle with the weight of everything unsaid, everything hidden beneath the surface. Elliot's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking to the folder, but he didn't reach for it. "What are you implying?" he asked, his voice low, though there was a tremor of something, fear, perhaps, beneath his calm facade. Sophie didn't flinch. She had known this would be difficult, but she couldn't stay silent. "Not anymore. I'm implying that the truth matters, Elliot. You've never talked about what happened to Evelyn, never let anyone, especially Oliver, know the truth. And I understand why. I do. Losing her, it broke you. But avoiding it, burying it, it's hurting all of you. It's hurting Oliver. He knows there's something you're not telling him, and so do I." Elliot's breath caught, and for a moment Sophie thought he might walk away. But he didn't. Instead, he stood there, staring at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. His walls, those impenetrable walls that he had so carefully constructed over the years, began to crack. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "I never wanted him to know," he said quietly. "I never wanted him to carry the weight of it, not when he already has so much on his plate." Sophie's eyes softened. "But he does carry it, Elliot. Whether you want him to or not. And so do you. You've been running from the truth, but you can't hide from it forever. Neither of you can." The silence stretched on, each second feeling like a heavy, suffocating weight. Sophie's words had struck a chord, and she could see it in his eyes. For the first time, Elliot didn't look like the impenetrable businessman she had come to know. He looked like a man on the edge, standing at the crossroads of his past and his future. Sophie's voice softened, a gentle reminder. "You don't have to face it alone, Elliot. And neither does Oliver." Elliot stood there for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her, as though he were contemplating something monumental. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable. "I've been so focused on protecting him, protecting us, that I forgot what it meant to really live, to really heal." Sophie nodded slowly. "It's not too late to start." The tension between them didn't dissolve instantly, but something had shifted. Sophie's courage had forced Elliot to confront his past, to face the ghosts of his wife's death that he had been avoiding for so long. And though he wasn't ready to face it all yet, he knew that he couldn't keep running. Not from the truth. Not from the life that had been waiting for him. And for the first time, Sophie felt like she was standing beside him. Not just as his son's caregiver, but as someone who might help him find his way back to the family he had lost. The days following the confrontation in the library were filled with a delicate tension. Sophie noticed a subtle shift in Elliot. The impenetrable walls he had so carefully constructed around himself were beginning to crumble, piece by piece. While he was still distant at times, there was an openness in his demeanor, a vulnerability he had never shown before. It was in the quiet moments, after the demands of the day had passed and Oliver was asleep, that Elliot began to let Sophie into his world. There were no cameras in the room, no prying eyes, just the two of them, sitting in the spacious living room, the soft hum of the city below filling the silence. Elliot would pour himself a drink, his hands steady but his gaze distant. And then, in the privacy of these moments, he would begin to talk. "I never wanted to be a burden to him," Elliot confessed one evening, his voice low, as though speaking the words was more painful than he could express. "Losing Evelyn, it broke me. I didn't just lose my wife. I lost my sense of self, my purpose. And the only thing I could focus on was Oliver. I had to protect him. I had to fix everything, or at least try to. But the truth is, I don't know if I can fix it all." Sophie sat across from him, her heart heavy as she listened. She had known the weight of loss, but to hear Elliot speak of it so openly, so rawly, stirred something deep inside her. She had witnessed the quiet pain in his eyes before, but now she saw it, an aching, desperate need for relief that he had never allowed himself to confront. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself," Elliot continued, his voice cracking ever so slightly. "There were moments, small moments, when I thought Evelyn might make it. I thought we might have time, but then she was gone. And now, I'm terrified. Terrified that I'll lose Oliver too." that I won't be enough, that I'll fail him like I failed her. Sophie didn't say anything for a moment, her heart aching for him. The guilt he carried was suffocating, a burden that weighed him down more than anything. She could see how deeply he loved his son, how fiercely he had tried to protect him, but in the process, he had neglected his own needs, his own healing. He had closed himself off from the world in the hopes of keeping his son safe from the same kind of pain he had experienced. "You're not failing him, Elliot," Sophie said softly, her words coming from a place of understanding. "You're doing the best you can, but you don't have to carry all of it on your own. You're not alone in this." Elliot looked at her then, his gaze searching. For the first time, Sophie could see the cracks in his armor, the exhaustion in his eyes that had always been masked by his control. He wasn't just mourning Evelyn's loss. He was mourning his own sense of identity, his own sense of self-worth, and he had been doing it in isolation. "I've been so afraid of losing him," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Afraid that if I let go of control, something will happen to him, that if I don't keep a tight grip on everything, I'll lose him too. I've been so scared to even think about it, about what that might look like." Sophie's heart ached for him. She knew that kind of fear, the kind that held you captive, that kept you trapped in a prison of your own making. She had felt it too, after William's death, after she had lost everything she had thought she would have. The fear of never being able to love again, the fear of getting close to someone only to lose them too. But she had learned, in her own time, that healing came from connection, not just from others, but from yourself. "I understand," she said quietly. "I understand more than you know. After William died, I didn't want to open myself up again. I was afraid of getting attached to anyone, afraid of losing someone else that I loved. I didn't think I could bear it, so I closed myself off. But the thing is, if you keep yourself closed off, you miss out on everything, the good and the bad. You miss out on the chance to heal, to move forward, to love again." Elliot was silent for a moment, taking in her words. Sophie could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between his fear and the possibility of something more. "I've always told myself I couldn't afford to love again," he said slowly, as if the admission was harder to say than he had imagined. "I've told myself that being there for Oliver was enough. But lately, I don't know. I don't know anymore. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just holding on to this pain because it's all I have left of Evelyn." Sophie's heart swelled, a mix of empathy and something deeper, something she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. She had always thought of herself as simply Oliver's caregiver, someone who could help the family heal. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. "I think," Sophie began, her voice soft yet firm, "that it's okay to miss Evelyn. It's okay to hold on to the love you had with her. But that doesn't mean you can't open your heart again. Not just to Oliver, but to life, to the possibility of something more." Elliot looked at her then, his eyes softer than they had ever been. He was no longer the stoic businessman, the man who hid behind control and distance. In this moment, he was just a man, vulnerable and human, seeking something that had been lost. The words he spoke next were barely a whisper, but they held a depth that Sophie had never heard from him before. "And what about you, Sophie? What if you're afraid too? Afraid to move forward, to let someone else in?" Sophie's breath caught, and for a moment she wasn't sure how to respond. She had spent so much time helping others heal, trying to fix the broken pieces of the Blackwell family, that she had never stopped to acknowledge her own needs, her own desires. "I am afraid," Sophie admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid of loving again, of losing someone else. But I also know that I don't want to spend the rest of my life in fear. I want to open my heart. I want to give love, to receive love. And I think that's something worth trying for." The air between them felt charged, heavy with the weight of everything they had shared. Sophie could feel the connection between them growing stronger, deeper. It wasn't just about Oliver anymore. It was about them. Their shared vulnerability, their shared grief, and their shared hope for something more. As if on cue, Oliver appeared in the doorway, his small voice breaking the moment. "Do you like my dad the way Mom did?" The question was innocent, simple, yet it carried the weight of everything they had been dancing around. Sophie turned to him, her heart in her throat. She knelt down beside him, meeting his wide, curious eyes. I think I'm starting to understand what that means, she said softly, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. And yes, I think I do. Oliver smiled, his face lighting up with a sweetness that made Sophie's heart swell. And in that moment, she realized that love wasn't about holding on to the past. It was about being brave enough to let go, to move forward, and to embrace the future. And as she looked at Elliot, she knew that somehow they would move forward together. The healing was just beginning. The days that followed were filled with a quiet kind of transformation. Sophie and Elliot had both begun to step away from the shadows of their pasts, allowing their lives to evolve into something new. Sophie's warmth, patience, and unspoken understanding had not only helped Oliver regain his strength, but it had also allowed Elliot to shed the weight of his guilt little by little. Yet, there was still much left unsaid between them, something unspoken but undeniable. And now, Elliot was ready to acknowledge it. It was a Friday evening, the kind of evening where the city of San Francisco seemed to slow down, as though holding its breath in the cool autumn air. Elliot had arranged a private dinner at the Blackwell estate, a gesture he had carefully planned in the weeks that had passed since his conversation with Sophie. The table was set simply but elegantly, candles flickering softly in the dim light of the grand dining room. The mood was intimate, but not overbearing, with only the distant sound of the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs below the penthouse. Sophie had dressed carefully for the occasion, a soft green dress that complemented the warmth of her complexion. And Elliot couldn't help but notice how beautiful she looked, how her presence filled the room in a way that made everything feel more alive. There was something different about her now. Less a caregiver, more a woman with her own strength, her own story, and yet still the woman who had helped them rebuild their shattered world. He stood at the entrance of the dining room, watching her as she took a seat at the table, her eyes meeting his with a softness he had come to cherish. There was a moment of hesitation, as if both of them knew that this dinner was more than just a simple meal. It was a turning point, a moment when the professional lines between them could no longer be ignored. "Thank you for doing this," Sophie said, breaking the silence. "I know this is not exactly something I was expecting when I first came here." Elliot smiled, the familiar smile that had been absent for so long. "I think we've both surprised each other in ways we didn't expect," he replied, his voice carrying an undertone of something deeper, something more sincere than he'd ever expressed before. As they sat down, Elliot raised his glass, his gaze lingering on Sophie as he spoke. "I wanted to take this moment to thank you, Sophie," he began, his voice steady but filled with an emotion that was new to him. "You've done more than help Oliver. You've helped me, more than I can express. You've not only brought back his joy and confidence, but you've helped me rediscover mine. And for that, I'm grateful. Truly." Ha! Sophie's eyes softened at his words, and she gave a small, appreciative nod. "Elliot, I didn't do anything extraordinary," she said, a quiet smile touching her lips. "I only did what felt right, what I knew had to be done. You and Oliver, you've both taught me so much. It's been a journey for all of us." The words hung in the air for a moment, their quiet significance underscored by the softness of the moment. As they continued with their meal, the conversation flowed more easily than it ever had before. The tension that once filled the spaces between them had melted away, replaced by an openness that neither of them had anticipated. They spoke about their pasts, their fears, their hopes. Sophie shared more of her own story, how she had learned to move forward after losing William, how she had been afraid to get close to anyone again. And in return, Elliot spoke of his own struggles, of the guilt he had carried all these years, the guilt that had kept him from truly living. And yet, as they spoke, it became clear that something new was blossoming between them. It was subtle at first, an unspoken understanding, a shared connection that ran deeper than words. Elliot found himself looking at Sophie in a way he hadn't before, not just as the woman who had brought his son back to life, but as someone who had touched something deep inside him, someone who made him feel alive again in ways he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Later that evening, after dinner, they stood together on the balcony, the cool air brushing against their skin. Below them, The lights of the city twinkled like stars, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the vast expanse of the ocean. "Sophie," Elliot said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About Evelyn, about Oliver, and about myself. There's something I need to do, something that's been haunting me for a long time." Sophie turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "What is it?" she asked, her voice quiet, as though sensing the gravity of his words. Elliot took a deep breath, his heart racing in his chest. "I've been living with the belief that Evelyn's death was my fault. I thought that if I had done something different, if I had been there for her in a different way, maybe she would still be here. And I've held on to that guilt, that weight, for so long. But I realize now that I can't keep carrying it. I need to know the truth. And I'm going to find out what really happened." Sophie looked at him, her expression a mixture of concern and understanding. She knew how difficult this would be for him, but she also knew that it was something he had to do for himself, for both his own peace of mind and for his future with Oliver. "I think that's a good idea," she said softly. "You deserve to know the truth, Elliot. You deserve to free yourself from that burden." The next day, Elliot made arrangements to investigate Evelyn's accident. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that there had been more to her death than he had ever allowed himself to consider. The police report he had once ignored hinted at the possibility of foul play, something he had never dared to believe. As the pieces fell into place, Elliot discovered that Evelyn's death was not the tragic accident he had thought, but a carefully orchestrated event. It was a revelation that both shocked and freed him. The guilt that had plagued him for years began to lift, replaced by a new understanding. Evelyn had not been taken from him because of something he had done. She had been taken by forces beyond his control. With this new knowledge, Elliot felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He could now focus on moving forward. No longer burdened by the past, he turned his attention to the future, to Oliver, and to Sophie. Oliver was thriving under Sophie's care. The transformation in him was evident to anyone who spent time with him. His energy was restored, his laughter returned, and his confidence grew daily. Elliot watched with pride as his son began to flourish, his bright smile lighting up the room whenever Sophie was near. And in those moments, Elliot knew that their family was no longer defined by tragedy. It was defined by hope, by love, and by the promise of new beginnings. Elliot turned to Sophie one evening as they sat together in the garden, the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze adding to the peaceful atmosphere. "I think we've both been given a second chance," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "A chance to heal, to build something new, together." Sophie met his gaze, her heart full. She had never imagined this, never imagined that she would find not only a job that fulfilled her, but a connection, a bond that was deeper than anything she had ever known. "I think you're right," she said, her smile lighting up her face. A second chance. And with that, the future seemed clearer than ever. They would face it together, side by side, building a life filled with love, hope, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. Months had passed since Elliot and Sophie had begun to carve out their new life together. The transformation in both of them was undeniable. Elliot, once a man burdened by grief and guilt, had found a kind of peace that had eluded him for so long. And Sophie, who had entered his world as a caregiver, had become an irreplaceable part of it. Their relationship, built on shared grief and vulnerability, had blossomed into something beautiful, something strong and undeniable. Now, on this quiet evening in late spring, Elliot stood before Sophie with a gift that had taken months to prepare, a symbol of everything they had overcome, everything they had built together. The sapphire ring, chosen by none other than Oliver himself, gleamed in the soft light of the estate. It was a perfect stone, deep blue, like the ocean Sophie had always loved, and as vibrant and endless as the stars she had often spoken of, as though the universe itself had conspired to bring them together. Sophie was seated at the edge of the garden, her face radiant, and as she looked up at Elliot, her heart skipped a beat. She had always known that something was different about their bond, that it was something that went beyond their shared moments of pain. But this was something beyond all expectations. It was a promise of the future they could build together. of all the moments that awaited them. Elliot dropped to one knee, his hand trembling ever so slightly as he held the ring out before her. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, the world around her seeming to still in that instant. Her heart raced, but there was no panic in her chest, only a sense of overwhelming love and certainty. "Sophie," Elliot began, his voice thick with emotion, "we've been through so much together, and you've brought so much light into my life, into Oliver's life. I can't imagine the rest of my days without you by my side. Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she looked at him, the deep connection they shared reflected in every glance. The ring sparkled between them, an unspoken promise of forever. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but her smile said everything. "Yes, I will." Elliot stood and gently placed the ring on her finger, his hands trembling with emotion. He kissed her forehead softly, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly right in the world. It wasn't just the ring or the ceremony. It was the life they had created, the love that had blossomed from the ashes of their pasts. It was a new beginning, a fresh start. Their wedding ceremony was intimate, elegant, and full of personal touches. It took place at the Blackwell estate, a place that had once been filled with the weight of loss and grief, but now radiated warmth and life. Oliver, dressed in a small suit, stood proudly by their side, beaming with joy. He had always been the center of their world, and now he was the heart of this new chapter. The ceremony was simple, nothing grandiose, but perfect in its own way. It blended memories of Evelyn, who was never far from their thoughts, with the new memories they were creating as a family. Sophie's dress was understated, yet elegant, her beauty not defined by the gown, but by the glow of happiness that surrounded her. The soft sound of music filled the air, the light breeze of the evening sweeping through the open garden. Guests mingled, enjoying the evening, but everything seemed to slow as the first light drizzle began to fall from the sky, delicate drops gently kissing the earth. It was a moment of quiet magic, an unplanned yet perfect punctuation to the celebration of their love. As the guests retreated indoors to seek shelter, Elliot and Sophie stood in the garden, their laughter filling the air as they glanced up at the rain. "Don't you think," Sophie said, her voice teasing, "that we should go inside before we get completely soaked?" Elliot, however, was already shaking his head with a smile. "No," he said softly, his gaze never leaving hers. "This feels like the right moment. It's just rain. Let's dance in it." Without another word, he extended his hand to her, and she took it without hesitation. He pulled her gently toward him, and for a brief moment, they stood there, simply holding each other under the soft drizzle. The air smelled of earth and rain, a fragrance so pure it felt like a blessing. The sky above them seemed to open up, the stars peeking through the clouds, as though the universe itself was watching them, approving of the love they had found. As the rain fell around them, Elliot took her into his arms, his hand resting against her back, pulling her closer. Their bodies moved slowly to the music that played in the background, but it was the rhythm of their hearts that kept them in sync, the unspoken connection that bound them together. "This is for Evelyn," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain, "for the love she gave you, and for the love we're building now." Elliot's grip tightened ever so slightly, his eyes closing for a brief moment as he nodded. He had carried the weight of Evelyn's memory for so long, had held on to the guilt and the sorrow of her loss. But now, standing in the rain, with Sophie in his arms, he realized something profound. He could honor her memory without being bound by it. It was time to live, to embrace the joy that was before him, without looking back. The rain became a symbol, a cleansing, a new beginning. As they swayed together, the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them. One life, one love, one shared future. The reception continued indoors, but Sophie and Elliot stayed out in the garden long after the others had gone inside. The rain gradually tapered off, but they remained there, holding each other, not needing words to express the depth of their connection. It was in the way they moved together, in the quiet gaze they shared, in the simple joy of being present with one another. And as the evening came to a close, with the last of the rain falling softly behind them, Elliot knew that their future had only just begun. The Blackwell home, once a place of sorrow, had been transformed into a place of love, laughter, and hope. a home filled with the promise of tomorrow. Sophie had come into their lives as a caregiver, but she had become so much more. She was the heart of their family, the one who had healed them both. And now, as they stood at the threshold of their future, Elliot knew that the next chapter would be one of endless possibilities, a journey that they would walk together, hand in hand. The rain may have fallen that night, but the love that had grown between them was everlasting. It would remain, strong and true, no matter what the future held. And so, as the Blackwell estate echoed with the laughter and joy of those they loved, Elliot and Sophie stepped forward into a new life, one filled with promise, with hope, and with the certainty that, no matter what, they would always dance together. As the night settled into a peaceful quiet, the Blackwell estate stood not just as a house, but as a symbol of transformation. Where once there had been shadows of grief, there was now a warm, steady light. Elliot and Sophie had created something extraordinary together, something that transcended the past, woven together with love, resilience, and the undeniable bond they shared. In the garden where they had danced in the rain, a new chapter was beginning. A chapter not defined by the weight of loss, but by the strength they had found in each other. The love that had blossomed between them had changed everything, healing wounds, mending hearts, and offering a promise of hope that would carry them through whatever the future might bring. They had both known pain, both carried burdens that seemed too heavy to bear. But through their shared vulnerability, they had found a way to carry each other, to heal together. They had learned that love was not just about overcoming the past, but about embracing it and then letting it guide them to something brighter. And so, as the stars shone above them, Elliot and Sophie stood hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. The rain had washed away their doubts, and with it, their fears. All that remained was the certainty that together, they could create a future that was as bright and endless as the ocean, as vast and limitless as the stars above. In the end, it wasn't just the rain that had changed them. It was the love they had found in each other and in the family they had built together. The Blackwell home was no longer a place defined by the weight of the past, but a place of laughter, of joy, and most importantly, of hope. And as the night grew deeper and the sounds of their new life filled the air, one thing was certain. No matter what came their way, they would always face it together, dancing through life, hand in hand, with love as their guide. The journey had only just begun. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it and found it valuable, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and share it with your friends. Your support means the world to us. Don't forget to leave a comment. Your feedback helps us grow and improve, and we love hearing your thoughts. We're so grateful for each one of you, and we can't wait to bring you more exciting content in the future. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.